Hello everyone. I wanted to make a video concerning the artificial womb and sort of my general thought process on where that's going. I saw a video fairly recently, within the last month or so anyway, from Coach Greg Adams talking about how the artificial womb is on the fringe or on the verge of being here, and women are the ones that are going to use it more often, right? His opinion was that despite a lot of the conversation within the men's community, that this was actually going to benefit women more. And I wanted to give my opinion on that because to some degree I don't have the same opinion as Coach Greg. I really think that it may be true that women use this technology more, but it's not as much of a game changer. And I agree more with Sandman, and I think TFM has talked about how this would be such a major difference maker for men because it really gives them access to, if this would really be something that men could utilize, it gives them access to something that they otherwise have to rely on women to make happen, right? So women already have control over reproduction pretty much, regardless of the artificial womb. Women can do in vitro, they can freeze their eggs. Women are already spending a lot of money to go through these different kind of procedures to try to find basically a sperm, basically a donor to get pregnant. And so the artificial womb, if it were developed and if it ran well, if it did what it could potentially do and wasn't prohibitively expensive, or if the state would pay for it for women in some cases, that's something that would potentially benefit women, but it's more of just a convenience factor, right? It's more of another method for doing what they can already do. And even without the technology and all the possibilities of freezing your eggs and doing in vitro, the thing is, women already have control of reproduction in terms of their own capacity to do that, right? In terms of having children directly the normal or the conventional way. So women already have control over reproduction. It's men that don't have access to being able to have children without going through the process of what normally causes that, right? Like basically getting a woman pregnant either on purpose or otherwise. You can hire a surrogate, right? You can spend a lot of money to hire a surrogate mom that more or less is not going to actually be the mother of your children, but that's very expensive, and it's also pretty risky, I think. I don't know a whole lot about that process, but the woman can just decide at some point that I'm just going to keep the kid, or I want to be the mom now. And I don't see how you can get around that, right? Especially when you take into account our society being willing to cater to that so much. So I think that there's a lot of cases where men really don't have an alternative. Men that want to have children, especially if they feel like that's required for them to live a fulfilled life, they have very limited options as it stands right now. They can either give a woman children in the West, right? They can do it the conventional way, get a woman pregnant, try to find a woman that's not like that, so to speak, and just hope that she doesn't pull the trigger and divorce them. That process is not recommended, but I can get why men still feel like they have to do that, as I've talked about before on this channel. If you feel like you must have kids, you're not going to leave the country, you're not going to leave the West, and you're not going to try to have a surrogate mom for your children, which again, itself is kind of potentially, I think, a problem, potentially problematic. But if you're going to do it the conventional way, there's always a pretty strong chance that that woman will just use those kids against you. You're their father in a genetic sense, but whether you'll actually be their father in a practical sense is pretty questionable because the woman is effectively in control from that point on, from the moment that you get her pregnant pretty much. She can decide to end the kids and not have your children at all, or she can just weaponize them against you or do a lot of other awful things. And you just have to hope at that point that she's not going to do that. So that's not really a very good option for men today. The other option, which I kind of suggested to some extent, is you can leave the country and go to a nation where feminism is not really a thing and hope that no-fault divorce doesn't happen in the country that you move to and try to find a woman there to marry or have kids with. or all of the above. And that in itself, if you have the means to do that, that could be an option, but the cost is leaving your country, right? The cost is you have to basically start a new life somewhere else in order to do that. Or maybe you can make enough money here and then move so that you can continue to be financially stable, but you're still going to have the problem of you're moving to a totally different place where maybe you don't have access to the same standard of living, basically because you don't want to be in a feminist culture anymore if you decide to have a family. That in itself is a difficult decision to make. So the options for men right now are not very good, other than what I've just said, or just not having kids, right? That's going to be the best option for most men, in my opinion, is just not to have children in this environment. But if the artificial womb would become a reality, if it would be technology that was readily available and not super expensive, then maybe that would be the better option for men. That would be a complete game changer, actually, because now men would not need women to have access to reproduction. So I do agree in principle or in theory with what Sandman and others have said. I think Coach Greg he thinks that because women may use this technology as a convenience factor for themselves, that it benefits them more, but it's more of a game changer for men if it's available to guys, because women already control reproduction. It doesn't really change the dynamic between men and women very much. It just gives women another option. Whereas for men, if men have access to this technology, it is a complete game changer, I think. So I do think that it's more of something that would benefit men. However, and this is kind of getting into the second half of the video, I also see this as something that could just not happen for a couple of main reasons. So the first major problem is that your political forces are going to align against men having access to this, because you're going to have, in my view, your feminists and your tradcons doing what they often do. They have different viewpoints, but they're going to do what they often do and align against this technology being available for men, right? What the feminists will say is that women need to have access to reproduction because the patriarchy will make it to where women don't have a choice, and women deserve to have this power because men have always controlled women. And so how is it that we can give men access to this technology now? It's just another way of controlling women's reproductive processes and stuff like that, right? That's what your feminists are going to say. They're going to say it's the patriarchy trying to hurt women somehow. Whereas your traditional conservatives are going to say, oh, that's not how reproduction's supposed to be. Men and women are supposed to have kids together, and let's just ignore the fact that women aren't traditional anymore. Women deserve the right to be moms. Women deserve the right to have, if not authority, then participation in reproduction. It's just something that women are naturally supposed to do, and you shouldn't be allowed to replace this with some form of technology that bypasses their motherly role and all that kind of stuff. And it's just another take on the same thing, right? The feminists and your traditional conservatives are both going to oppose men having access to this technology, in my view. I can see this coming, right? This is just one of those classic things where even though you have two different ideologies, both of those ideologies are very gynocentric when it comes to this issue. And a lot of these people, both the feminazis and your trad twats, they're going to say, oh, men shouldn't have access to this. On one hand, they're going to say it's the patriarchy and it's just another example of men controlling women and men not seeing women as the ones that deserve to be the mothers and all that, right? It's just men disrespecting women more. And then on the other side, it's, oh, it's unnatural, it's wrong. Women are mothers, right? Women are the ones that are supposed to do this, not some technology, not some machine. Even though, as many have pointed out, ideologically they're different, they are often two sides of the same coin when it comes to this issue. And they are going to probably align together and work together to prevent men from having access to this technology if they can. from a legal political perspective. The other issue, potentially, besides just the political resistance and the attempts to pass laws so that men can't just bypass women and use the artificial womb, the other issue is it seems to me like we're still decades away from this technology being realized, even if it's realized on behalf of women, right? Even if women are the only ones allowed to use it. I know that the article that Coach Greg talked about, I read through it briefly. It's not really a very long article. It acts as if this technology could be here right now. It's just that we have these ethical concerns because it involves gene selection and making sure that your kids have the right genetics, and there's going to be people that are against that for better reasons, I think, right? Not just for gynocentric reasons, but because now you can basically genetically manipulate people before they're born. That is a valid concern, I think, because that could lead to all kinds of crazy attempts to kind of make superhumans, and that's its own issue, but it's more of a science fiction thing, right? It's not something that I think really could be put into practical effect. I don't see the evidence for that really. So this is something that is probably several decades away at the very least, even if women wanted it, even if they supported it for themselves and the government had an incentive to follow along with that, because women's desires basically determine what the policy priorities are in a lot of cases. But even with that, I just think it's several decades away. And the problem is our society is already in a steep state of decline, right? I'm sorry, but I don't know that society as it is going to exist several decades from now. So that's the other issue, right? You can look at the massive amount of debt that the United States is in. You can look at the completely unsustainable dynamic between men and women today. You can look at how there's no social contract for men and women to actually raise their kids together. You can look at so many different things that are going on that are just not sustainable in Western society. And I don't want to make this video about that primarily. I just think that it's clear, I think it's clear to a lot of my viewers as well, that this society may not exist in several decades. The United States may not exist. Other Western countries may be a shadow of their former self as well, mainly because we're not taking care of or addressing the true problems that we have in the West at all, right? And you can talk about how society, civilization only exists for a period of time. I've talked about that with Reverend 20 Piece and others, where there's a lot of evidence that after about 250 years or so, society just reaches a stage of terminal decline. And whether or not that's universally true, it certainly seems true with what we see going on in Western countries now. So my point with that is, by the time this technology could be ready to truly emerge, one, it may be illegal for men to use it, or just the funding may go dry completely if men are allowed to use it. Or the other possibility too is society is just trying to feed people at that point so that they don't revolt en masse and overthrow the government. We may be at a point where it's like, hey, we see you have all this money to build a lab for all this sophisticated equipment to have these artificial wombs. We're going to take your money because the state's going to be totalitarian at that point, right? People aren't going to have any rights. We're just going to take your money and use it to feed people. Or we're going to take your money and use it to fund a war against this other country that's also in a state of decline. That could easily be the case in the West just a few decades from now, right? I don't see us resolving our issues, whether it's the debt. Since I evoked Sandman before, right? He talks about the oil crisis is going to happen once we go past peak oil, right? I've heard him discuss that pretty convincingly, that eventually we're going to run out of these fossil fuels. Then what happens? There are a lot of things that are just not being dealt with at all. Again, the overall situation between men and women raising their kids together or not raising their kids together. This society can only continue to limp along for so many decades more. It may collapse a few years from now. It may collapse several decades from now. But this technology may not be available by then. And at that point, we're probably entering another dark age. And so it won't be developed because there's just going to be chaos, right? There's just going to be some form of either anarchy or a totalitarian state or tribal government. Who knows what it'll look like, but it ain't going to be pretty. Once the West can no longer sustain itself at all and everything truly begins to unravel, we're going to be lucky if we don't destroy the planet in that process, to be honest. And this is something that I think applies to everything else when you're talking about several decades into the future. I think we're at a point now where we have to consider how far the decline in our society has gone before we can make a statement about that. Because a lot of the stuff that we might like to see several decades in the future, if society just completely falls apart, none of it's going to happen. None of it that's good anyway. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make with that. And the sort of final conclusion that I wanted to draw from all the stuff I've been saying is that, especially for guys now, even younger men today, I would not count on something like the artificial womb coming in and allowing you to have a new way to have kids, right? I wouldn't count on this happening, even if you're like 18 years old today, even if you're just emerging as a young adult, and maybe you could have kids 20, 30 years in the future or more, I still wouldn't count on this technology being available. Even though theoretically, as I started off saying, this could be a game changer for men, I don't think it'll be allowed, or I don't think it'll happen in terms of the positive impact it could have on allowing men to just avoid basically using women for reproduction, right? It's going to be opposed politically by the left and the right. It could be developed in a way that, oh, women need to have access to this, but men are going to be forbidden from using this technology. Or it could just not happen at all, and then society collapses and it's all forgotten about for centuries. I mean, that's a possibility as well. So I wouldn't get my hopes up too much. I don't want to be totally negative on it. I think it could be a game changer for men, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes, or if it does, we're going to be old men not interested in having kids anyway. So I think it's really better, probably, even for younger guys today, to just look at the situation as it is now, and maybe as it could be in the near future, several years from now. Things are not going to get better for men in terms of their dealings with women. If you are going to try to have kids, you are in a difficult situation. And I think you ultimately have to make a decision of whether it's worth it or not. Is it worth trying to find the so-called right woman and hoping that she doesn't kick you out of your own home? Is it worth moving to another country and trying to start a new life, or maybe taking certain things from the successes that you may have had here and using that to kind of fund a new life to sort of jumpstart your move to a different country? But is it worth totally changing your environment like that just to try to find a woman in a non-feminist country where she doesn't have access to no-fault divorce or false accusations, or just this general, oh, you need to fulfill your gender roles as a man, but I'm not doing crap for you? Is it worth trying to move to a country that probably has a lower overall standard of living in many ways, hoping that feminism doesn't eventually spread there, trying to have kids in that new environment and that new arrangement? Maybe that's worth it for some guys. Or again, surrogacy is another option, where a woman basically carries a child for you and she signs supposedly her rights away to actually be the mother of those kids. But then how do you know she's not going to be like, oh, I changed my mind later on? How is that going to work? So you've got to look at your options that are available, but I would not really include the artificial womb as an option right now. I don't know that it'll ever happen. I think that it could be a game changer for men, but that's kind of another reason why it may not happen. Because at some level, women are going to realize that, and they're going to oppose that through both feminism and traditional conservative ideologies. It's not going to be something that's going to be easy as a process for men to gain access to. There's a lot of things going against it, even though theoretically, I think Sandman and others are basically right. It's going to be very difficult to actually implement without encountering that kind of resistance. Or again, society may just collapse or have totally different priorities in sort of its end stage before it collapses, to the point where this sort of technology doesn't emerge at all. And I think at the end of the day, most men are probably better off just not trying to have kids, even those guys that otherwise would have. And I'm going to make a video about that at some point as well, in terms of men who look at the environment and analyze things and say, you know what, I'm just not going to have kids. I might have been a good father. I may have enjoyed having a family. I'm not going to do that in an environment where I'm basically just a guest in my own home. And so I think your choice is to accept the sort of consequence of not having kids versus some really sort of difficult and really not great options. If you're going to have kids the conventional way, or move to another country, or pay for surrogacy and hope that it works out, or adopt potentially, but then who's going to give a single man the ability to adopt, right? A lot of state governments are not going to allow for that, right? Your options are not very good in a lot of cases. And I think a lot of guys are probably better off just not having kids, or recognizing these risks, recognizing the pretty extensive negatives that are involved in a lot of these options, and picking one if you feel like you absolutely have to have children. But otherwise, I think a lot of men, probably most men, are better off just maybe seeing that the artificial womb could be a game changer, but not counting on that sort of option to be available to them, and probably just not having kids in this environment in many cases, if you think that's the best option for you and none of the alternatives really seem to be worthwhile.